Welcome to today's webinar on maximising the power of feedback. My name is Melinda Clifford. I am the coordinator for the elementary and secondary ELE programs at the Ministry of Education, and I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague, Dawn.
I'm Dawn Union. I'm a teacher from the Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board, currently on a loan of service working with Melinda on the ELA team.
Thanks, Dawn. So let's start off with a quick case study based on an example that Susan Brookhart gave in one of her workshops on feedback. Brookhart is Professor Emerita in the School of Education at Duquesne University and an independent educational consultant and author based in Los Angeles, California. An elementary class here is working on persuasive writing. The students were asked to write a letter to the librarian after a book was stolen, offering some reasons why the librarian should buy the book again. So here is an example of one student's letter to the school librarian. After that, we'll look at some questions to consider. Dear Mrs. James, I'm sorry that X book was stolen. I liked it a lot and wish you would buy it back for the school library. The book was really funny and made me laugh lots when I read it. I think my friends would really like it too. There were mysteries in it as well, which are cool to read. So let's take a look at some of the feedback from the teacher in red. Capital letter, there are some spelling mistakes that have been highlighted here, many spelling mistakes. There are issues with punctuation that have been brought to the students' attention. And then there's a comment at the end with an exclamation mark that says, add more. So what do you think the student reading this feedback would probably think? When we did this presentation live, a lot of teachers in the chat wrote things like, well, they'd probably think that they didn't do a very good job. They probably think that they need to improve their writing and that they're probably not very good at writing. So what was the goal of the assignment? If we go up to the top and look at the goal, students were asked to write a letter to the librarian after a book was stolen, offering some reasons why the librarian should buy the book again. So what did this student write in terms of reasons to support why they think the librarian should buy it again? Well, first of all, they said that the book was really funny and it made them laugh lots when they read it. They also thought that their peers would really enjoy reading it and that there were mysteries in it, which they thought were really cool as well. So did the student accomplish the goal of the assignment? Essentially, yes, they did. So is this a really good example of what effective feedback looks like? Hopefully, we can assume that no, it is not. So we've just had an opportunity to see what ineffective feedback can look like. And this brings us to the focus of our workshop with you today. This presentation is a little bit different from others that we've given. Because we're focusing on feedback, we've designed it to reflect as much as possible how feedback fits in with classroom practice. So rather than our usual title for this type of webinar, which would read in this session, we've called it Learning Intentions. And you could equally call it Learning Goals. Just as we would in a lesson, in explaining to our students what we want them to learn, we've outlined here what we hope to cover in the next hour or so with you. So we'll be looking at a student-centered model of feedback, which is going to lead us into looking at creating a culture of learning and feedback in the classroom. And then we'll move into why formative assessment is a crucial element of and for feedback. We'll go through the 6 most effective qualities of effective feedback, and we'll end this webinar with an overview of what to do and what not to do when providing feedback to students. Over to you, Dawn.
Thanks, Melinda. We're going to start off with an entry slip. So please think about what effective feedback looks like and sounds like. And keep your ideas in mind as we go through the session. It's very possible that your beliefs will be validated or you might revise your thinking. According to Black and William, feedback, if done well, has a tremendous effect and a tremendous impact on achievement, particularly for students who struggle. A few moments ago with the case study, we saw an example of feedback that was not so good. So Brookhart reminds us that it's easy to see a moderate or high-level student's work that doesn't have typographical errors and push on the thinking behind that work. But often the student whose technical writing skills are less developed will only get feedback on writing conventions without the push to further their thinking. And while this is often done unintentionally, the difference in feedback reinforces bias and could contribute to different expectations for different students. This means we have to be careful because students who struggle should also be held to a high level of thinking and have their ideas honored, even when they are still working to bring their writing skills up to grade level. And we have to consider that when teachers focus only on the elements students are struggling with, feedback can be really demotivating. Brookhart states, for the most part, it's ideas that drive people to learn, not grammar. So let's return to the letter to Mrs. James, the librarian. What feedback would have been effective for the student in our case study? In the live session, many people thought it would be important to point out the positive aspects of the writing and focus on how the student tried to persuade the librarian to replace the book. And here are some general reminders. Make sure success criteria is clear. Feedback should focus on the task and not on the learner. And suggestions should help students move towards attaining the learning goal. So the Brookhart example that we just looked at corroborates the research that says feedback can have highly positive effects on learning, but also highly negative effects where students may in fact be turned off learning. There are a host of variables that can play into whether or not students accept feedback and act on it to further their own learning. And according to the research, up to a third of the feedback that students receive can have negative consequences. As we go through the session today, we're going to look at how we can use feedback to produce positive effects. You may be wondering how you will measure your success of your participation today. And we made our learning goals for this session clear a few slides back, but how will you know if you've attained those goals? By the end of today's session, you should be able to differentiate between good and bad feedback. You should be able to describe elements that contribute to a positive culture of learning and feedback. And you'll be able to name the 3 basic questions that feedback should always help students answer about their own learning. And you'll be able to describe qualities of effective feedback. If you think back to our learning goals, you'll see how our success criteria here are directly linked to them. And I'm going to pass it back to Melinda.
Thanks, Dawn. So according to John Hattie's 2009 meta-analysis in his groundbreaking report, Visible Learning, the most powerful single influence enhancing achievement is feedback. And if I can draw your attention to the graphic that you're looking at now, starting at the top, feedback can help students achieve success, and success increases student motivation. Motivation then leads to more engagement in the learning process and increased confidence in the content that they're learning, which not surprisingly leads to higher levels of self-confidence, and hopefully through ongoing effective feedback during the learning process, the cycle continues. So students today need to know so much more than if they got the right answer or the wrong answer in a test. They need to be able to solve problems, ask pertinent questions, gather information, reason with evidence, and ultimately make judgments in complex and dynamic situations. So it's fundamental that in the feedback that we give them, that it guide them in this process. John Hattie and Cameron Brooks came up with this model of student-centered feedback, which we're presenting to you because it provides a really nice visual for how the feedback process works. As you can see, the jigsaw is interconnected and overlapping, and the student is at the very center. The inner circle is the feedback loop, and there are 3 parts to this loop, beginning with clarifying success. So if you're familiar with Hattie's work or the work of Black and William on assessment and feedback, they both state that all feedback should help students answer 3 basic questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? And what's my next step? Or how will I get there? So the first thing feedback needs to do is to clarify success. To do this, the learning goal and the success criteria need to be clear so that students can answer that first question, where am I going? Check-in on progress is the second section in the loop, and feedback here should help students figure out and answer the question, where am I now? So what's my current understanding of the issue, the situation, or the task? This is where students can be prompted to access and assess their prior knowledge and modify what they already know by either building on it or reassessing their understanding. And in the last part of the loop, promote improvement, that should help students answer the question, what's my next step? Or how will I get there? How do I achieve my learning goal and attain the criteria for success? So any and all feedback needs to close this loop for students so that they know exactly where they're going, what their current understanding is, and how they can get there. The outside loop in the model presents the big ideas that include shifting thinking, reviewing teaching practice, and building a learning culture in the classroom. So we're shifting from a focus on teaching to a focus on learning. And the shift in thinking for many of us is going to be to move away from the teaching model that we may have experienced ourselves as students, where the student is passive, they listen to the learning content, soak it up like a sponge, and regurgitate the answers for a test. In shifting our thinking, we acknowledge that students need to be active participants in their own learning. We have to assess what they already know about what we're teaching them and then help them move forward from there. It reminds me of a university professor that I had for Victorian literature once upon a time, whose course notes were literally yellow with age and handwritten, if that gives you some idea. The novels had never changed. The same content was taught every course, semester after semester, regardless of what the class already knew about Victorian literature, and regardless of any questions that anyone had that were not related to that content. The essay at the end of the course was the same as every previous semester, and this probably made it really easy for the teacher or the professor to prep and grade, but it didn't help instill a love for Victorian literature in any of his students. Teachers need to make the bridge between, or the connections from, what learners know and what they need to teach. For many of us, we can't let ourselves fall into the trap of teaching the same way that we were taught. We need to help students assess not only surface knowledge, but also deeper learning like problem solving, analysis, and synthesis. Students probably won't remember the spelling and grammar errors that they made on a paper. But if we can push them to further their thinking, that's what will serve them in their futures. So secondly, in the outer loop, we have reviewing practice. So this section asks teachers to reflect on how they currently give feedback. Is the feedback always related to the learning goal? Is it generally feedback in the form of praise? This type of feedback is great for students to hear, and it can be a real motivator, but it tends to focus the feedback on the student and not on the task. So it doesn't really help them answer any of those three questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? What's my next step? Corrective feedback, let's say like for spelling and grammar, can be very helpful if it's given as the student is writing and when they're in a position to make changes to improve their work. But we need to provide our students with information in the feedback that we give them that will move them forward in the task. And we need to promote self-evaluation and reflection so that the students are asking themselves about their own progress and setting goals for their own learning. This brings us to the last point in the outer loop, building the learning culture. Effective feedback requires a culture of learning where we can celebrate the mistakes. So there's a well-known acronym, FAIL, which stands for the first attempt in learning. If we can set up our classrooms to embrace these mistakes that students make so that they don't feel like they failed, but rather they know that they can learn from their mistakes, then that's where we can increase motivation. And to tell us more about creating a culture of feedback and learning, I'll pass it over to Dawn.
All right, thank you, Melinda. We know based on extensive research, as well as our own practical experience, that feedback is crucial to the learning process. So how do we go about the work of creating a culture of feedback and learning in our classrooms? One of the biggest elements in creating a culture of feedback in the classroom is to embrace mistakes and see them as opportunities to provide feedback and explanation. We need to value improvement over achievement so that our students are not seeing their learning in terms of pass or fail or a percentage or how well they did compared to the rest of the class. And trust is a big part of it. Students need to be able to express their misunderstanding or confusion, knowing that they won't be ridiculed. They need to know that they can try something and not be afraid if they don't get it right the first time. We have to set challenging goals and tap into the creativity and curiosity of students. The more challenging the task, the greater the payoff in motivation when students achieve success. But the challenge has to be realistic and attainable. A culture of feedback is collaborative, and this means that students are often working together. When they know what success looks like, they can interact with their peers and help each other. The idea of building a growth mindset goes back to valuing improvement over achievement and the entire learning process, not just the end result. And we want to foster student agency so that our students are constantly reflecting on their learning and on their progress and adjusting the strategies they use as they learn. And Melinda, I'll let you take over from here.
Thanks, Dawn. So if we think back to the inner loop of the jigsaw model, we want feedback to help students answer those three questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? And how will I get there? Or what's my next step? One of the best ways that we can do this is through the use of formative assessments. Assessments used formatively shape feedback and instruction as the teacher determines what needs to be taught next to bridge the gap between what they know and what they need to know. Oops. Our discussion of assessment pertains specifically to formative assessment, which is assessment for learning and which happens in an ongoing manner throughout the learning process. This is very different to summative evaluation, which is assessment of learning and usually at the end of a learning cycle, and it's looked after by our colleagues in ELA evaluation. In formative assessment, teachers focus on evidence that displays the student's knowledge, understanding, and skills as they shape their instruction according to the needs of their students. It's a valuable tool because it enables teachers to provide immediate and ongoing feedback during instruction to improve student learning, which is intended to close that gap between where the students are and where you want them to be. Assessment as learning happens when students evaluate their own learning and performance. So to do this, they ask the questions. And they use a range of strategies to decide what they know and what they can do, and how to use assessment for their own learning. Our focus today on feedback stems from the new talk tools that we've created with our PAC subcommittee. That's the Provincial Advisory Council for Teachers of English. The first chart on the left of the screen is the developmental continuum of oracy skills, designed to be used by teachers for planning instruction and providing feedback. So this is our assessment for learning tool for talk. And the second continuum on the right is for students to promote reflection and goal setting in their own development of the talk competency. So they can use the descriptors to situate themselves, set goals to work towards, and reflect on the strategies and processes that will help them get there. So essentially, that's our assessment as learning tool. The tools that you see here are both available on the Literacy Today website, literacytoday.ca, along with the Oracy Skills tool, which is the foundational tool that outlines all of the talk or Oracy skills included in our ELA programs. The Oracy Skills tool describes the what to teach, and the continua that you see here describe what the skills look like in the classroom in action. There's also a glossary of Oracy terms that defines the words that are highlighted in bold on the documents, and all of these documents can be found in the Oracy Toolkit on the website. So there's a brand new book also that was just published online this year called Building Better Schools with Evidence-Based Policy, Adaptable Policy for Teachers and School Leaders. And in this book, there's a chapter called Feedback for Learning by Brooks, Burton and Hattie. And I draw your attention to it because the link to the book, if you're interested, is in the references at the end of this webinar. And Chapter 9 suggests policy measures to implement a culture of feedback as a school or possibly as a department. The book is open access, so that means it's free to everyone. And Brooks, Burton and Hattie state that effective feedback aims to improve the learner rather than simply fix the work. Formative assessment, which we've been discussing, is what drives opportunities for feedback. So to wrap up this section, formative assessment can be formal or informal. Formal formative assessment focuses on evidence provided by the student, whereas informal formative assessment is that kind of on-the-fly, synchronous feedback as you're working with the student during the learning process. So the main thing to remember is that formative assessment is an ongoing process where we focus on the development of learning. It is not a summative product at the end of a learning cycle. Back to you, Dawn.
Thanks, Melinda. Do you remember these little emojis from earlier on? And we discussed good and bad feedback. Take a few minutes to think about some of the qualities of effective feedback that can support student learning. What do you think they include? We're going to highlight 6 essential qualities of good, effective feedback. First, feedback has to be timely. Feedback needs to come when students are in the process of working towards the learning goal so it can help them achieve a desired outcome. Feedback shouldn't come later when they've already finished the task, when it's too late to improve. Feedback should be goal-directed. We talked about this already, how we need to communicate clear learning goals and success criteria so students know where they're going. Next, feedback should be descriptive. Instead of telling students only if their answer is right or wrong, we need to show them how they can improve so they know how they're going and where they are in their learning and how they can close the gap. And when students are on the wrong track, it's critical to ensure that errors are welcomed and as they are an important ingredient for enhancing learning. Feedback is collaborative, teachers and students working together. It involves dialogue and discussion, student-teacher conferencing, and also collaborating with peers. Feedback also needs to be ongoing, so students have multiple opportunities to adjust and improve as they work towards success. And finally, feedback should encourage self-assessment so students learn to monitor their own progress, set goals, and identify strategies that will help them achieve their goals. And this can happen through reflections, identifying strengths and challenges, comparing their work to success criteria, and with students letting teachers know what type of feedback would be most beneficial for them. So there we have 6 qualities of effective feedback. So let's see if you remember those 6 qualities of effective feedback that we just looked at. Do you have somewhere to jot down what you remember? In our live session, we used Mentimeter and we asked participants to name 6 qualities and their responses created a word cloud. And we saw quite quickly that the 6 qualities of effective feedback figured prominently in the word cloud, so we knew that many people remembered and could actually name them. And let's think about this little quiz and consider if it is actually a good example of providing effective feedback. Was it collaborative, timely, ongoing, goal-directed, descriptive? Did it encourage self-assessment? What other feedback methods or tools could we have used? There are a lot of possibilities depending on the context. We know a lot of elementary teachers use Seesaw, and one option there is the possibility of recording an audio message. Some people like Flipgrid. We can add written comments in digital form if we're using Google Classroom or Google Docs. And we don't have to use technology, of course. We can just talk with students. A quick word on the fly or a real sit-down conference, either way will work. As teachers, the information we get from something like the word cloud can help us to plan our next steps. So can we move on if most people did well, or depending on what's needed, reteach to the whole class, or offer a small group session for a few students? And that leads us to the next point, the muddiest point. The idea of the muddiest point originated in 1989 with a Harvard University statistics professor, Frederick Mosteller, who used the strategy to gauge his students' understanding, and is to be used with discretion so as not to concentrate too much on the negative. But this professor suggested that if 25% of students mention the same point, it may need to be taught again in class time. If 20% mention the same thing, a review session may be enough, and at 15%, an explanatory handout might be sufficient to clear up the misunderstandings. So right now, we might ask these questions. What has been the muddiest point so far in the session? What topic or ideas are the least clear to you? And that would identify the muddiest point. And at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Melinda.
Thanks, Dawn. So let's just take a moment to recap. Grant Wiggins, who's well known for his work on assessment and assessing student performance, said that effective feedback requires that a person has a goal, takes action to achieve the goal, and receives goal-related information about their actions. So we're going to take a few moments to recap what we've looked at today, and then we'll do one final activity together. So let's just illustrate some of what we've been talking about. by looking at some steps that we can follow to clarify success. We'll start with the 3 questions in the feedback loop. Can you remember what they are? The first one is, where am I going? Where am I now? And how will I get there? If we break down using an example, if we break them down, they may look like this. So let's say, first of all, we give students 2 comparative samples and we ask them which of the 2 samples is more effective. Following that, we could ask them to justify their answers and state why they think one is more effective than the other, and to highlight the successful parts that make the more successful one better. We could then ask them, how does your own work compare to these samples? And then finally, what's your next step to improve your own work? So we're going to follow the steps on the previous slide. The learning goal in this exercise is to use figurative language in a narrative text. So we'll begin by looking at 2 comparative samples. Let's read them both and think about which one is more effective, sample A or sample B. So sample A, Mr. Bell walked down a quiet street holding onto his bowler hat so that the strong wind wouldn't blow it off his head. The wind blew harder and harder. Sample B, Mr. Bell hurries down the street, clutching his bowler hat so the whipping winds couldn't steal it. Eyes darting everywhere, he pushed on into the path of the gale. So which one is more effective and why? Considering the learning goal, which is to use figurative language in a narrative text. So if students are working on this writing task, they know where they're going because the goal is to use figurative language. We want to jump in at an appropriate time for our feedback to help them reflect on where they are now. We could ask students to think about their own work and how it compares to the writing samples, and then have them consider how they can improve or how to get where they need to be. And we've got some highlighting here that we may want to share with our students. We could say that the writing sample B on the right is more interesting to read because we have elements of characterization. Oops. So the notion of show, don't tell. We've also got elements of imagery that help the reader visualize as they read through the use of personification. And finally, there's some foreshadowing at the end, which helps to stretch it out. So the reader's left wondering what's going to happen to Mr. Bell as he makes his way into the storm. So with these 3 elements in mind, we could ask our students to go back to their own writing pieces and see if they can rework some of the content and integrate a couple of these elements of figurative language if they haven't already. So a clear learning goal told students that the focus was to use figurative language in a narrative text. This information helps students answer the first question, where am I going? Providing 2 writing samples and asking students to analyze which one is better and why, and then compare those samples against their own writing with information on a variety of figurative writing techniques can help students answer the second question, where am I now? And prompting them to include one or more elements of figurative language that they've just looked at can help them answer the final question, how will I get there?
And if this was done as a mini lesson, maybe to begin a writing workshop, some students would be able to go ahead and work independently, and they'd be able to answer the questions, where am I now and how will I get there? And some might benefit from peer feedback, while others might need some one-on-one conferencing with the teacher.
Absolutely. So if we compare this example to the 6 qualities of effective feedback that we saw earlier, feedback like this is timely because it's happening during the writing process while students have time to improve their work. It's goal-directed and descriptive. It can be collaborative if students are encouraged to look at the writing samples together and to justify their reasons for which one is better. And they may also read one another's work, so they may engage in some peer editing and make suggestions in light of the goal too. And we hope that the feedback would be ongoing throughout the writing process, as the goal may change to focus on different elements within one piece. And finally, this type of comparison, asking students to analyze writing samples and then evaluate their own work, encourages self-assessment and reflection. Okay, what not to do? Back to you, Dawn.
All right, so thanks, Melinda. We've been focusing on what to do, and now at this point, we'll just briefly review by looking at what not to do. and we'd like to share with you a conversation recently overheard in the staff room at a school near you.
Hi, Miss. How are you? I haven't seen you since that workshop we were at about effective feedback.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I've been thinking a lot about that workshop. One thing that kind of bothers me, spending time on instructions, when kids should just be getting right to work.
Well, that's true, but I know we're always pressed for time in class, but remember that you have to establish clear goals and that success criteria. You'll see that it's worth the time investment.
Another thing I find challenging, I have 4 groups of Sec 5 students, and that's a lot of correcting. I do my best, but I really only have time to put a mark on each assignment.
I know marking everything is tempting, especially for those report cards. I know we have them and it's required, but you want to be cautious about providing only grades. Remember that feedback should note those areas of strength and provide information on how to improve without any grading. Remember that research by William they were talking about? He found that students who received grades showed no learning gains, but those students who got just comments showed really big improvements. And surprisingly, the kids that got grades and comments didn't do any better.
Well, I wonder if conferencing could work. I can make a schedule, but then we need to stick to it. And when I'm ready to meet with a student, they should be ready for me.
Yeah, it's tough to manage schedules while students in the middle of learning. If you interrupt them while they're actively engaged in a task, it can be pretty disruptive and it might even impede their learning.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've also been thinking it's important to be honest with my students and tell them straight out when their work is terrible.
Tough love, huh? I know it might be hard sometimes, but that kind of feedback can really discourage students, can even threaten their self-esteem. That's just going to turn them off learning altogether.
So maybe I need to be honest in a way that helps them see what they need to work on. But I never seem to have enough time, and it's so much faster if I just tell kids what to do.
I know prompting them to get the right answer, it's easy to do, but it doesn't really help them learn how to solve the problem. Hints can be super helpful, but they can also be abused. If you use them to scaffold, sure, but just be careful not to overuse them.
Do you remember those 3 questions they kept talking about? What were they again?
Where am I now? Where am I going? And how will I get there?
That last one is confusing. How will I get where?
Oh, and they were talking about like it means how will the students achieve what you want them to learn?
Okay, now I get it. Well, I see there's only 45 minutes left before the bell, so I've got to run.
But 45 minutes, aren't you going to stay for lunch? I don't know why no one wants to eat with me. Okay, so before we finish up, we'd like to leave you with just these questions for reflection. What types of formative assessment do you currently use? What feedback practices will you continue to use in your classroom? And what feedback practices, if any, will you add to or change to your current use of feedback to close that loop? What steps could you take to ensure a culture of feedback in your classroom or in the school? And do you see yourself collaborating with other teachers perhaps? Could this lead to establishing a school-wide policy or practice for feedback? The references that we've mentioned today are all here if you would like to access the Brooks, Cameron, and Burton book that I mentioned earlier, which is open access. The link is available here. And finally, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us at admin@literacytoday.ca. And thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us.